afternoon. We begin the day with the seeds of Russia's war in Ukraine and what the world may be forced to reap. Today, the UN Secretary-General said that the war now threatens all of humanity. He said Vladimir Putin's decision to put his country's nuclear arsenal on high alert has once again made the threat of a nuclear conflict clear and present. And he warned that the fighting has placed the safety of Ukraine's nuclear power plants in question. And there is also the worry that now has a place at our kitchen tables. Russia and Ukraine are among the world's largest grain exporters. This spring, if farmers are fighting instead of planning, global food prices will skyrocket. And later this year, in poorer countries, many could be faced with food shortages. I want you to take a listen to what the UN Secretary-General, Antonio Guterres, said earlier today.
This war goes far beyond Ukraine. It is also an assault on the world's most vulnerable people and countries. Food, fuel, and fertilizer prices are skyrocketing. Supply chains are being disrupted, and the costs and delays of transportation of imported goods, when available, are at record levels. And all of this is hitting the poorest, the hardest, and planting the seeds for political instability and unrest around the globe. Further escalation of the war, whether by accident or design, threatens all of humanity. Raising the alert of Russian nuclear forces is a bone-chilling development. The prospect of nuclear conflict, once unthinkable, is now back within the realm of possibility.
Well, almost 3 million people have fled Ukraine since fighting began there almost 3 weeks ago. Once thriving cities are now in ruins. Trapped civilians are running out of food and water, faced with the impossible choice of risking their lives if they stay, or also risking coming under Russian fire if they attempt to flee.
This bus was struck by parts of a Russian missile in a northern district of Kiev. The explosion damaged electric cables and nearby buildings. Earlier, firefighters rescued people from the smouldering ruins of a 9-story apartment building hit during an early morning attack. Part of renewed fighting on the outskirts of the capital. The city has so far resisted Russia's advance.
A rocket hit the building. At first, I saw the blast, and then 5 or 6 seconds later, there was an explosion. The entrance door was simply blown out.
We really weren't expecting this. We thought nothing bad could happen to a small building on the outskirts of Kiev. We went to sleep as usual. At around 5 o'clock, bam! I couldn't understand where I was. We were in our pajamas. Russia denies targeting civilians and is holding fast to its description of its war as a special military operation. The Defense Ministry in Moscow says its forces have destroyed nearly 4,000 objects of Ukraine's military infrastructure. Among its targets, a military training ground near the Polish border in western Ukraine, hit on Sunday. It was Moscow's closest strike so far to NATO territory. Still, President Volodymyr Zelensky indicated peace talks could be making progress.
Representatives of our countries are holding daily talks via video conference. Our delegation has a clear task to do everything to arrange the meeting of the presidents. The meeting, I'm sure, people are waiting for. Obviously, this is a difficult story, a hard path, but we need this path.
A path desperately needed in eastern regions under sustained Russian assault. This is the city of Kramatorsk. Eyewitness video from a resident there showed destruction to her apartment in a 5-story building in the aftermath of an air raid.
Well, it is clear that the Russian invasion of Ukraine has created a humanitarian crisis that now stretches across Europe. And as Russian forces intensify their attacks, the threat of fighting spilling over into NATO territory is also growing. My first guest tonight was Director of Policy Planning at NATO when Russia annexed Crimea. He says NATO has a moral and a strategic responsibility to push back against Russian aggression in Ukraine. I'm happy to welcome to the program tonight Fabrice Potier. Mr. Potier, it's good to have you with us.
Good evening.
The war in Ukraine is getting closer and closer, it seems, to NATO territory, with the weekend's attack, for example, on that military base. Now, you've said that demands a clear message from NATO. What should that message be?
Well, first, the message should be that we are not going to let ourselves intimidated by Vladimir Putin's war of aggression, and that NATO and NATO countries will continue to support in every meaningful way President Zelensky and the Ukrainian forces in defending their territory. So that means the arms shipment that have been going on over the past few weeks should continue, and I would argue should be amplified in number, but also in quality, and including air defense systems that will allow the Ukrainians to basically protect their territory, at least the western part of Ukraine, and to avoid this kind of attacks we have seen yesterday.
So you agree that a no-fly zone over Ukraine by NATO, that's a no-go?
I think that it's important to listen to what the Ukrainian leadership and what the Ukrainian forces need. And I think it's important to give them what they need to prosecute that war and push back on Vladimir Putin. So if they ask for fighter jets, I think we should do everything possible to provide them with what they need. And I also know from very good sources that they are asking for air defense systems, medium-range air defense systems, to be able to shoot down Russian fighter jets and shoot down Russian missiles. And I think we can provide that. We have that in our stock in NATO, and it's a question of political decision here.
Mr. Potier, do you think that we have an accurate picture of the strength and stability of the Russian military?
I think it's a mixed picture. Clearly, we have seen a Russian military struggling with basic planning, communications. So I think it's a different story from what we have seen since after the 2008 Georgian war, where the Russian military allegedly went through a pretty significant reform and injection of resources. However, whilst in the past we may have overestimated the Russian military, it's also important not to underestimate the Russian military, because they're still capable of conducting pretty large operations, but more importantly, they are capable of destroying and killing many people, and this is what we're seeing in Ukraine right now.
What do you make of these U.S. reports that Russia has asked China for military and economic aid in its war on Ukraine?
I think this is probably one of the most critical points of that war so far. And should China come to the aid, including from a military point of view, to Russia, I think that war, which we can argue is a regional war, a European war, could well quickly turn into a global war. And this is why I think there was a very stern warning from President Biden's National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, to the Chinese about the economic consequences of aiding the Russians. So we are at a very critical point as to whether that war can be contained regionally or whether it might actually spill over globally.
Well, how can it plan in this environment? I mean, we've had the director of the CIA say that Vladimir Putin is living in a propaganda bubble, in a mindset that the West cannot reliably read. I mean, when we push Vladimir Putin, how do we know when we've pushed him too far or when we've pushed him into a corner?
Well, it's not because he's living under, some kind of wicked ideology that he's not a rational actor. And everything in the past shows that he's responding to strengths with much more prudence and caution than we might think. So I think it's time for NATO to take its courage in two hands and be willing to control escalation vis-a-vis Vladimir Putin, rather than what we have now, where Putin is escalating at will and defining the terms of that confrontation.
You know, I asked you earlier this evening, I'll ask you again, you know, many assume that Vladimir Putin is a rational actor. But how can we be sure that he is making decisions based on what the rest of the world would consider to be reasoned, logic, a rational actor? How do we know that that's what he is?
You can never be 100% sure, but I think what you can also be sure is that doing nothing is actually having a huge humanitarian, economic, and actually security cost, not just for Ukraine, but for the whole of Europe. So we are not in a scenario where on one hand, we do nothing and the risk is zero, and on the other hand, we do everything and the risk is enormous. I think it's about how we can gradually push back on Vladimir Putin and make him fail. And again, everything shows that, yes, the Putin and the Russian forces are aggressive and are disruptive, but whenever there has been a pushback in the past, either in Syria or elsewhere, they actually backtrack. So I think we have to assume that indeed they are still rational enough to know the cost, and especially the devastating cost of certain actions, and to backtrack.
Well, I think many people in the world hope that you are exactly correct with that assessment. Fabrice Potier, former Director of Policy Planning with NATO. Mr. Potier, we appreciate your time and your insights tonight. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Tell me, please, what is your name?
Juan.
Juan? Where are you from?
The U.S.
Yes. What happened to you?
We crossed the first bridge in Irpin. We're going to film other refugees leaving, and we got into a car. Somebody offered to take us to the other bridge, and we crossed a checkpoint, and they start shooting at us. So the driver turned around, and they kept shooting. It's two of us. My friend is Brent Renault, and he's been shot and left behind.
And how is he?
I don't know.
You don't know.
Well, that was the U.S. journalist Juan Arredondo being interviewed from inside a hospital. He was injured in a suburb of Kyiv that has been under heavy bombardment by Russian forces for days. Arredondo did not know at the time, but his colleague, Brent Renault, died at the scene. Renault is the first foreign journalist killed in Ukraine since Russia's invasion began. Several media crews have been attacked while reporting on the war. Ukrainian President Zelensky says that Russia is deliberately attacking journalists.
An American journalist, Brent Renault, was killed today in the Kyiv region. His colleague was wounded. It was a deliberate attack by Russian troops. They knew what they were doing, but it seems like not everyone in the West knows what the Russians are doing.
Well, my next guest is the Deputy Director of the International Press Institute. That's a global network that aims to protect press freedom. Scott Griffin, it's good to have you with us tonight. Let me ask you, do we have any evidence that Russian forces are targeting journalists in Ukraine?
Well, we don't have independent confirmation of that. We have, obviously, the statements by the Ukrainian authorities. And certainly that is a plausible explanation of what happened, given we know that Russia is targeting civilians in Ukraine, so that is obviously possible, but we don't have certainty about what happened in that incident. What we do know for sure is that under international humanitarian law, journalists are civilians, and civilians are never acceptable targets in a conflict. And so this would be a war crime. And our position, obviously, as IPI, is that this needs to be investigated, and those responsible, whether that ultimately is Russian forces or somebody else, needs to be held responsible. So it's also worth mentioning this is the first death of a foreign journalist in Ukraine, but not the first death of a media worker. Actually, during the Russian shelling of the television tower in Kiev, a camera operator was killed in that attack as well. So we see that the situation is becoming more dangerous for the press day after day.
Are you concerned that Ukraine may soon become simply too dangerous for foreign journalists? I mean, something similar to what we saw happen in Syria.
Absolutely. I mean, the situation is very fluid, and there's no question that it's becoming more dangerous every day. The attacks on the Russian attacks are becoming more intense. More cities are coming under shelling. Also, larger portions of the Ukrainian territory are coming under attack. So these are going to be very difficult decisions for media organizations to be making in the next few days, not to mention the next few weeks, about how to approach the situation, when to possibly pull their journalists out. And what's really important here is that journalists who are still there, we need to make sure they have the proper equipment. Their organizations need to ensure that they are properly prepared and trained to go in these situations, which are very dangerous. Journalists need to be prepared for that.
Scott, do you think they are? Do you think journalists are prepared? I mean, because we were talking in the newsroom today, you know, we could get in the car and drive. It would be a long drive, but we could drive to Ukraine and be in the middle of a war zone. I mean, you've got that country being flooded with foreign journalists. Do you think that they've moved in too hastily? Are they prepared for what the Russian forces could present them?
Look, some are and some aren't. There are journalists who have experience reporting from war zones, and their media organizations have the means to provide them with the necessary safety equipment, although no one has perfect safety in these types of situations. But we also know that there are media organizations, including in countries neighboring Ukraine, that have never experienced a war zone, and they don't have the means to buy armored vests or other types of equipment. So this is a big concern. I think a lot of media organizations and journalists were caught off guard in the early days of the conflict. I do think that is hopefully changing. People are realizing what needs to happen before going into these situations. But again, there is, I think, a wide range in terms of preparedness. And we hope that media organizations who are sending their people in, and also the freelancers who they are working with, are prepared.
Do you worry that this war could be a defining event for an entire generation of journalists? To be the last major war, the war in Iraq had embedded journalists, but this is, the first war really since maybe Vietnam for Americans, where you've seen a lot of U.S. journalists rush to a war zone, and that's the case also here in Germany as for other countries. Is this going to be a defining event?
Well, it's obviously possible. We're still in the early days of this conflict. We don't know. We hope the violence also doesn't escalate. I do want to say a few words also about the situation of Ukrainian journalists. Obviously, the situation is complex and difficult for foreign journalists. And you may well be right that this becomes a defining moment. We are also focused very much on what is happening to local journalists in Ukraine. For them, the situation is also extremely difficult because it's more difficult for them to leave the country. And they're also more intent on staying to cover this conflict for their local communities, but obviously also for the wider world. And as I said, most of them actually are staying in the country at the moment. That may change, of course, depending on the course that this conflict takes, but they are also, on the ground, the first ones there reporting together with foreign journalists coming in. So we're also very much focused right now on their safety.
Scott, before we let you go, I just want to get your reaction to what has gone viral on social media this evening, and that's the video of a woman going inside a Russian news studio during a live news broadcast, going behind the anchor with a poster protesting the war, saying no war. I mean, the fact that she was able to do that is amazing in Russia. What's your reaction?
Well, it's astonishing that she was able to do that. But I think what I was just reading also, that the newspaper Novaya Gazeta, which is one of the very, very last independent media working in Russia, reported on this incident, but had to black out what the protester was saying because they're not able to use the necessary words to actually cover this incident. Right. They're not able to say war or invasion. And I don't know if people understand the level of censorship that is happening in Russia at the moment. Not only, obviously, are protests being violently suppressed, but nearly all independent media have been forced out of the country, closed. Hundreds of journalists have left the country over the past few weeks. And again, The authorities are using sort of Orwellian language to describe this operation and bring the hammer down on any journalist or media who dared to report what is actually happening in Ukraine as a war or an invasion. And we fear that this censorship, which is unprecedented in Russia since the fall of the Soviet Union, is only going to increase. Things look very serious and very negative in Russia at the moment.
And we can assume with a high degree of certainty that the woman, the protester who held up that sign in the Russian news broadcast, she's going to prison, isn't she?
It's obviously very likely, very possible. We've seen, as I'm sure you have as well, shocking videos of people on the street. Even one I've seen, holding a sign that said nothing, a blank sign, and immediately being taken away by security forces. We understand that these protesters face a sort of different fates. Some are released immediately with warnings. Others may be held for longer periods of time. But the strategy of the authorities is fairly clear here. It's to shut down immediately any type of critical gestures in public with violent force to prevent this from turning into a wider movement, which is also the explanation for this violent crackdown, so that people inside Russia don't see the images of what is actually happening in Ukraine.
Okay.
The Kremlin obviously fears the public reaction from this.
Scott Griffin, Deputy Director of the International Press Institute. Scott, we appreciate your time and your insights tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.